Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank the organisers, Linda and Craig, for the invitation to come and speak to you today, and thank you to the chair of the session. So I don't want to keep you from your lunch. I'm sure that all of you are very hungry, but of course we're going to be talking about nutrition in this too, but you'll get to your nutrition shortly. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the people that have been involved in this work. I'm going to be giving a summary of the work that we've been doing over the last 4 or so years in the MB program. There's been a large number of people involved from my team, the Animal Nutrition and Physiology team based here in Palmerston North, a range of different scientists from different teams within AgResearch, also colleagues at Massey, a number of postgrad students and international interns, and also our partners, Spring Sheep Dairy, Maui Milk and Kingsmead, and certainly acknowledge the funding that we've received from MB, also from AgMard, MFAT for PhD scholarships, and our co-funding from our industry partners. Couldn't be done without a very large team. So, as we know, dairy ewes produce about 25% of their total milk yield in the first 30 days of lactation. So therefore there's a significant drive to look at the lamb rearing system to try and capture as much commercial milk as possible, and we've heard about that throughout the course of the day, and Dave gave a great talk on that this morning. So it's important to capture that milk, but it's also important to look after the lamb rearing, to be able to make sure that we get really good replacement animals and we're utilising all the offspring. And I do applaud the New Zealand dairy sheep industry for putting a focus on utilising all of the lambs in the industry. Now, lamb rearing is a major cost, particularly for artificial rearing, but it can be a cost when you're doing the mixed type system or natural rearing because you're not harvesting that commercial milk. And so therefore there's a strong focus to optimise those rearing systems. So over the last 4 or so years we've developed both the science and extension program that's looking at a range of different options for lamb rearing in a New Zealand context, building on the international research that's out there in our local knowledge. So as we heard this morning, there's multiple systems that are being used worldwide. There's removal of the lamb immediately post-birth and artificial rearing. There's a mixed system where mum does the job and you can still harvest milk as well, so the hybrid system. Or there's the natural rearing where the lamb stays with the mother and then once the lamb is weaned, then the ewe goes onto the milking platform. For the New Zealand focus, we obviously want to have cost-effective systems. But we also need to make sure that this is for our pasture-based system. So our lambs need to be reared for a life of being either 100% on pasture as they grow into adulthood and are milked, or potentially going into a hybrid type system. And we also need to think about the scale of our operations. We've got some small operators and we've got some larger operators, and one system is not necessarily going to fit all requirements. So we've looked at outdoor lambing and natural rearing, outdoor lambing and artificial rearing, and also indoor lambing and artificial rearing related systems. Now, we've done a number of different studies, and I'm not going to go through all of them here. There's all sorts of different things that we've done, and we are going to be having a workshop in the next session where if people are interested in some of the other work that we've done, we can have a conversation about that. I'm just going to touch on the first 4 here, and I want to note that in addition to studying the production outcomes, so growth rates, live weights, intakes, those sorts of things, survivability of the lambs, we've also had quite a strong focus on understanding the underpinning physiological responses in those animals. And I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I wanted to note that we have looked at that. And the reason for that is how we feed and manage our animals in early life has a really important impact on the way that the organ systems develop and how they function, and that can have lifetime consequences for the performance of that animal. So it's not just about how big the lamb is or whether it's alive or it's dead, it's actually understanding its physiology as well. It's important. So the first study was a restricted milk system, and so the driver behind this system was to evaluate the age of weaning on growth rate and some of these aspects of physiology. Now, this restricted milk system is one where you have low milk inputs, so some systems use ad libitum milk. This was one where we're trying to keep the milk inputs down to try and stimulate solid feed intake, accelerate the development of the rumen, and be able to wean that animal off milk early as possible. So, many of the systems that we're using, this this type of feeding system, we're weaning the lambs at 6 weeks of age. And so our question here was, can we drive that even further and wean that lamb by 4 weeks of age on a low milk input system? So these lambs had meal available basically from day one. The lambs these were meat breeds. They were on mum for the first 2 days to get sufficient colostrum, and then they came into our system. In the first week, they were fed 4 times a day, then down to 3 times a day, and then thereafter we went down to 2 times a day or once daily for our early weaning group at 4 weeks, or we kept them at 3 times a day and then stepped them down to 2 and 1 times a day. And the reason we do that step down is to just avoid weaning stress, gradually take them off milk, slowly increases their solid feed intake. Those animals then went outside and they had grass and concentrate available, and then we kept them till they were about 16 weeks old on pasture only. So in a nutshell, what we saw pre-weaning is we had slightly higher growth rates in our 6-week weaning group, but we would expect that because those lambs were consuming more milk, so their nutrient intake was higher. But what we saw after that is post-weaning, we actually didn't have any statistical difference in their growth rate, and by 16 weeks of age, those animals were exactly the same weight. So we also, in the physiology, we looked at the small intestine and immune function of those animals. They were exactly the same. What we saw is better rumen development in those early weaned lambs. They actually established adult-like fermentation patterns by 4 weeks of age. So we couldn't distinguish them from the older animals. So this is one system that has potential to reduce costs while maintaining good levels of animal health and growth rates. And a modification of this system has been adopted by Maui Milk, and within the workshop that we've got next, Peter's kindly agreed to talk a bit more about their systems. The second one that we looked at was ad libitum milk feeding with automatic feeders. So this is a system where the De La Val is one of the automatic feeders that's being used. The idea there is you can lower your labour input by putting the animals on an automatic feeder. You're not feeding them by bottles or cafeteria type systems, and the aim is to try and accelerate growth. So what we did here is we wanted to compare an ad libitum milk with an auto feeder, weaning at 6 weeks of age, to the restricted milk step-down system that I just talked about at 4 weeks of age. So all the groups had ad libitum, chaff and meal and water. In this system, we used the urban feeder. Now the reason we used this is that it's connected to an EID collar and we can measure individual intakes of animals. So for our scientific studies, we need to know what their intake is as well as their growth rate, which is why we went with this type of system. So essentially in the results, as you would expect when you're feeding lots of milk, you get very, very good growth rates in that ad libitum system. So we averaged over 400 grams a day pre-weaning in those animals, compared to just below 200 grams a day in our restricted milk system, which was similar to the previous year. Post-weaning, no difference in average daily gain. And what you see over here is the total amount of milk intake. So yes, the milk intake is higher, you do get greater growth rates, and what we found is that those animals, when given free access to milk, they actually consumed 32 to 53% of their initial body weight in milk powder. So in our restricted system, we're feeding at about 20% to start with. But the greater growth rates that we got pre-weaning translated into a 24 kilo lamb versus a 15 kilo lamb at 6 weeks of age. Interestingly enough, fibre and meal intake was the same. We expected the high milk intake lambs to consume less solid feed, and that didn't happen in this experiment. So we know that the ad libitum milk is good for growth rate. What we don't know yet, and we're still working on, is what is the lifetime implications for that. And one aspect of that that's really important is rapid growth rate early in life appears, at least in a dairy cow model, linked to future milk production. So that's something that we're following up on. The other learning out of that is automatic feeders work well for large-scale operations. They do reduce the labour component. But also the restricted milk and early weaning works well for the higher birth weight lambs. So it was another learning that came out of that. When you've got very small lambs, feeding the restricted milk system doesn't work quite so well for them. They need additional milk input. Then the third system is one that we did in collaboration with Kingsmead, with Miles and Janet, and the idea here was natural rearing with early weaning. And so we were looking at growth rate and these physiological responses, some of the commercial milk production and the practicality of doing this system. So we had 100 ewes, there was singles, twins and triplets, 50 in each group. So the first group was just the standard protocol of weaning those lambs at about 5 or 6 weeks, or it was supposed to be 6 to 8 weeks of lactation, but we ended up weaning them a little bit earlier. So they stayed on mum, and once they were weaned, they went onto the milking platform. The other ones was the mixed system that Dave talked about this morning, where we actually did a hybrid, where we took the lambs off and milked the ewes for a period of time before the lambs were weaned. So that separation of the ewes and of the lambs in that second group, the separation started from 2 weeks of age, and the lambs were weaned by 5 weeks. What we found, no difference in pre-weaning average daily gain in those lambs, and no difference in post-weaning average daily gain of those lambs. Those lambs, when they were separated off mum for 8 hours during the day, had access to meal, and they really got into the meal very early on, and I think that helped with their growth rates. So no overall effect on lamb performance or survivability. We had very, very, very low losses. I can't actually remember any lambs dying in this study. There was a few just prior to the study starting, first 2 days of life, but not during the study. And the commercial milk production was increased, and we've presented that previously. And Miles' estimate was around about a 30% increase in the amount of cheese that he was able to produce, and he didn't note any differences or any major challenges with his cheese production, which was interesting. So he didn't use that system in 2016 because he had a very poor season, didn't have a lot of grass, and so he was worried about the nutrition of the ewes, so we didn't use this system. He used it again last year, and it worked very well. So this could be quite a good option, but there are some practical things to be thinking about, and we can talk about that in the workshop next if anyone's interested. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about is where we fed ad libitum milk with auto feeders, and then they went outside at 3 weeks of age and they got put on bulk feeders until 5 weeks and they were weaned. And they had ad libitum concentrate all the way through and pasture available from when they went outside. And we compared that to a new system, basically ad libitum milk, but we didn't put any grain into the system, no meal into the system. We just put them onto grass at 3 weeks when they went outside. And the aim there was to see whether we could simplify the system. Could we just rear these lambs with putting a lot of money into the milk replacer, feed them on the milk replacer, and not have to put the meal into the system if we had good quality pasture? And basically what we found here is there were some slight differences in pre-weaning average daily gain, but it wasn't huge. Once we went outside, there was no difference in average daily gain. In this period here, there was a drop. This was after the milk weaning. And we did have greater growth rates in those lambs that were fed meal, and that's because they had the additional energy-dense feed available in addition to pasture. But what I want to point out here is this finding that we had here. At the time we took meal out of the diet, we transitioned those animals over a 2-week period, which is the current best practice for transitioning animals off one feed and onto another to enable the rumen and the rumen microbes to adapt. We applied that, and what we ended up with was these animals that were on meal went into negative energy balance. And we've got the blood data to back it up. These animals that were on grass didn't go into negative energy balance. They didn't have that transition. And essentially what that meant is by 12 weeks of age, the additional growth that we'd put into those animals that had the meal early on was almost lost by 12 weeks of age because they'd mobilised all of those reserves to help them with that transition. So that's telling us that we need to learn a little bit more about how to manage these dietary transitions to make sure that we're not putting the stress on the animals, and we can also optimise growth. This system could work well. The low input system of just pasture and milk could work well if you've got good quality pasture available, but good quality pasture is essential for this. It's not going to work if you don't have it. So yeah, another potential option which we can talk about a bit more later if people are interested. The other thing that Dave Stevens presented, and some conferences last year is another interesting finding with those lambs that were reared with meal in the diet, for some reason had lower average daily gain post weaning, and we don't fully understand what causes that, but we're looking into that. So, just to summarise, we've looked at a suite of different options, and I've only just mentioned a few. Some of these options have been beta tested on farm and have been adapted and modified, and we don't expect anyone to pick up these systems in the way that we've done it, but I think we've got some learnings to help inform how farmers may want to rear lambs. We've had some workshops with our partners to help with the transfer of that knowledge, and we've got another one today, and we're planning another one in the near future. And I think one other learning we've had out of this with working closely with our industry partners is we've learnt more about what are the challenges on farm, and therefore what are the specific research needs that we need to focus our research dollar on that's going to make a difference. But it's also enabled to our producers to understand how challenging research can be, but also how valuable it can be to provide that additional knowledge and input into the systems to improve productivity as well as cost effectiveness and animal welfare. We've made a number of connections with international researchers that's accelerated the outcome of this, and as a result of all of this, building really strong relationships with industry to support not just the ongoing research but adoption and practice change on farm, which hopefully will ultimately be translated into various protocols and fact sheets that will help the industry going forward. Thank you.